I called the loan company about the mysterious payments toward my student loans. They said, "Your mother-in-law has been making them for 2 years." I stared at my phone while the representative repeated that Beverly, my husband's mother, had paid $36,000 toward my student loans without telling me, and I felt sick because Beverly hated me. "Are you sure? Beverly Whitman?" The representative confirmed and said she'd been paying $1,500 a month like clockwork since I married her son. I hung up and drove straight to my husband Paul, who was at lunch with his mother at the country club she belonged to. "We need to talk about my loans." Beverly smiled that cold smile she always gave me. "Finally noticed, did you? I was wondering how long it would take someone of your education level to check their own finances." Paul looked confused. "What's going on?" I showed him my loan statement. "Your mother has been paying them, secretly, for 2 years. Paul turned to his mother, excited. "Mom, that's amazing. Thank you for helping us." But Beverly wasn't looking at him, she was staring at me. "I wasn't helping you, dear. I was investing." My stomach dropped because I knew that tone. "Investing in what?" She pulled out a folder from her purse that she'd apparently been carrying around waiting for this moment. Every payment I made was a loan. With interest. "You now owe me $42,000. She slid the paper across the table. "I've been charging you 10% interest compounded monthly." Paul grabbed the paper. "Mom, what is this?" Beverly patted his hand. "It's business, sweetheart. I knew she'd never be able to pay her loans on her teacher salary, so I created an opportunity. She owes me now instead of the government, and I have much better collection methods." I looked at the contract, except I'd never signed anything. "I never agreed to this. You can't just transfer my debt to yourself without my consent." She laughed, and it was cruel. "Actually, I can. See, I've been making payments in your name using information Paul gave me when you got married. Account numbers, social security, everything I needed." Paul went pale. "I gave you that so you could send a wedding gift to our account." Beverly ignored him. "Those payments created a pattern of acceptance. My lawyer says it's implied consent. You benefited from my payments for 2 years without objecting, so now you owe me." She pulled out more papers. "And unlike federal loans, mine aren't income-based. You owe the full amount in 90 days or I'll put a lien on your assets." We didn't have assets. We rented an apartment and drove used cars. We don't have $42,000. Beverly's smile got bigger. "I know, which is why I've prepared an alternative payment plan." She pulled out another document. "You sign over your teaching license to me and I'll forgive the debt." I stared at her. "My teaching license? Why would you want that?" She leaned back in her chair. "I don't want it. I want you to not have it. Without your ability to teach, you'll have to leave the state to find work. Paul will realize long distance doesn't work, and we can finally find him someone appropriate." Paul stood up, knocking his water over. "You're trying to destroy my marriage?" Beverly didn't even blink. "I'm trying to save you from it. She's beneath us. A public school teacher from a nobody family. You could have married the Hamilton girl. Her father owns 3 factories." She turned to me. "You have 72 hours to decide. Give up your career or pay me in full." That night, Paul and I went through everything she'd sent. The payments, the interest calculations, the implied consent argument. It was insane, but she'd hired expensive lawyers to make it look legitimate. She's been planning this for 2 years. Every payment was a trap. Paul was furious. "I'm calling her right now." But I stopped him because I'd found something. "Wait, look at this." She made the payments from her trust account. Paul didn't understand why that mattered. "So?" I smiled for the first time all day. "Your grandmother set up that trust. Remember what the terms were?" Paul's eyes went wide. "The trust can only be used for direct family members' education and medical expenses." I nodded. "And I'm direct family. I'm your wife. She's been using the trust correctly. But here's the thing. Trust payments are gifts, not loans. She can't convert a gift to a loan after the fact." We called Paul's grandmother's estate lawyer, who confirmed it. "Beverly has been misusing trust documentation. Those payments were legally gifts under the trust terms. She has no right to repayment." He said something else that made us both smile. Beverly had been filing false papers with the trust administrator the whole time. The lawyer's words hit me like a truck, because this wasn't just some mean trick anymore. Paul grabbed my hand under the table and squeezed it hard. We looked at each other, and I could see he understood what this meant too. His mother had committed actual fraud against his dead grandmother's trust fund. Not just manipulation or being mean, but real crimes that could send her to jail. The lawyer kept talking about documentation and legal terms, but all I could hear was the word fraud repeating in my head like a drum. Paul's face went white and then red, and I thought he might throw up right there in the office. We thanked the lawyer and walked to our car without saying anything, because what do you even say when you find out your mother is a criminal? We got home around 8 that night and spread every single paper Beverly had given us across our kitchen table. Paul made coffee even though neither of us would sleep anyway. I started reading through her fake loan agreement again, looking for anything we missed. That's when I saw it buried in the small print at the bottom of page 3. The account numbers she listed for my student loans were wrong. Not just a little wrong like a typo, but completely different numbers that didn't match any of my actual loan accounts. I showed Paul, and he pulled up my real loan statements on his laptop to compare them. The numbers weren't even close. Beverly had created this whole loan agreement after the fact using fake account information. She'd probably typed it up the week before she ambushed us at the country club. Paul stared at the papers and said some words I'd never heard him use before. We stayed up until 4 in the morning going through everything line by line, finding more problems with her story. Paul called the trust administrator first thing when their office opened at 9. I sat next to him on the couch listening to his side of the conversation. He asked for copies of every payment authorization Beverly had ever submitted for my loans. The administrator sounded confused about why Paul wanted this and asked if there was a problem. Paul kept his voice steady and just said he needed to review the documentation for personal reasons. The administrator went quiet for a minute and I could hear papers shuffling through the phone. Finally, she said she'd send everything within 48 hours and asked Paul to confirm our mailing address. He thanked her and hung up, and we both just sat there knowing the next 2 days would be the longest of our lives. I had to go to work that Tuesday, even though my brain was completely somewhere else. My third graders were doing math worksheets, and I kept staring at the clock wondering what Beverly was doing right then. Did she know we were building a case against her? Or did she think we'd just give up and let her win? Lunch duty came, and I stood in the cafeteria watching kids trade snacks while my stomach twisted itself into knots. Ophelia walked over holding her sandwich and asked if I was okay because apparently I looked terrible. I pulled her into the hallway and told her the basic story about Beverly's fake loan and the trust fraud. Ophelia's mouth fell open and she said it sounded like something from a bad Lifetime movie where the villain is some rich lady who hates her daughter-in-law. She hugged me right there in the hallway and said Beverly was going to regret messing with me. That made me feel a little better, even though I knew the fight was just starting. Paul met with his dad Khalid that afternoon at a coffee shop downtown. He didn't tell Beverly about the meeting because we both knew she'd try to stop it or show up herself. I stayed home and tried to grade papers, but mostly just paced around our apartment waiting for Paul to call. He finally texted me around 5 saying he was on his way back. When he walked through the door, his face looked sad and angry at the same time. Khalid had admitted he knew about the payments, but thought they were real gifts to help us out. Paul had explained what Beverly actually did with the fake loan and the fraud and everything. Khalid got really uncomfortable and kept saying Beverly handles all the finances in their marriage. Paul said his dad looked almost scared when he realized what Beverly had done. Before Paul left, Khalid had squeezed his shoulder and said he was sorry for not paying more attention to what his wife was doing with the trust money. The trust documents showed up Thursday evening in a big envelope delivered by a courier who made me sign for them. Paul and I cleared our kitchen table and spread out every single page. There were dozens of payment authorization forms that Beverly had filled out over 2 years. Every single one said educational gift for daughter-in-law at the top in Beverly's handwriting. Not one mentioned loans or repayment or interest or anything like that. Just gift over and over and over again. Paul took pictures of each page with his phone while I organized them by date. The paper trail was perfect and clear and completely destroyed Beverly's story about loans. She'd been lying to the trust administrator the whole time, telling them she was making gifts when she was planning to claim they were loans later. I felt this weird mix of relief and anger looking at all that proof. Relief because we had evidence she was wrong, and anger because she'd done this knowing it would hurt us. Paul called his mother Friday morning and put her on speaker, so I could hear everything. Beverly answered on the second ring, sounding cheerful like nothing was wrong. Paul asked her straight out why the trust paperwork said gifts when she was trying to claim loans. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Beverly's voice came back cold and careful. She said the trust required that specific language for tax purposes, but they'd had a verbal agreement about repayment. Paul looked at me, and I could see he didn't believe her anymore. He asked what verbal agreement and when they'd discussed it. Beverly stumbled over her words, saying it was understood and implied, and Paul knew what she meant. Her voice got higher and tighter as she talked, and I realized she was panicking because her plan was falling apart. I grabbed the phone from Paul's hand before I could stop myself. My voice came out stronger than I expected when I told Beverly that verbal agreements about loans over $600 weren't legally valid in our state. I knew this because one of my students' parents were a paralegal who'd mentioned it during a parent-teacher conference last year. Beverly went completely silent again, and when she spoke, her voice was like ice. She said we'd see what her lawyers had to say about all this. I told her to have her lawyers call us because we had our own legal help now. She hung up without saying goodbye, and Paul and I looked at each other knowing we'd just declared war. We contacted Tamara Larson that same afternoon using the number the estate lawyer had given us. Paul explained the whole situation over the phone while I listened on speaker. Tamara asked a few questions about the trust terms and the payment documentation and Beverly's fake loan agreement. When Paul finished talking, Tamara said she'd review everything for free because cases like this made her mad. She said trust misuse within families happened more than people realized, and usually the victims didn't fight back because they felt guilty. She told us not to feel guilty because protecting ourselves from fraud wasn't mean or wrong. We sent her photos of all the documents that night, and she promised to review them over the weekend. Tamara called us back Saturday afternoon, which was only 6 hours after we'd sent the documents. She said this never happened, but our case was so clear she couldn't wait to tell us. Beverly had been committing trust fraud by lying about gifts being loans. The fake loan documents with the wrong account numbers could be extra fraud charges on top of the trust violations. Tamara's voice got excited as she explained how strong our case was. She said any judge would see through Beverly's lies in about 5 minutes. Paul asked what we should do next, and Tamara said she'd draft a cease and desist letter to send Beverly by Monday. She also said we should file a formal complaint with the trust administrator about Beverly's misuse of the trust funds. I felt something like hope for the first time since this whole nightmare started. I found Paul around midnight sitting in our car in the parking lot of our apartment building. He wasn't doing anything, just staring through the windshield at the brick wall in front of him with both hands on the steering wheel like he was driving somewhere except the engine was off. I opened the passenger door and got in beside him and waited because I could tell he needed to say something, but didn't know how to start. The silence stretched out for maybe 5 minutes before he finally spoke. He said he always knew his mother was controlling, but he never thought she'd actually break laws to manipulate him. His voice cracked on the word laws like saying it out loud made it more real. I reached over and took his hand and told him we'd get through this together. He nodded but didn't look at me, and I could see tears on his cheeks that he wasn't bothering to wipe away. We sat there for another 20 minutes before going inside to bed where neither of us slept much. The next morning was day 3 of Beverly's 72-hour deadline, and my phone rang at 8:30 while I was getting ready for work. Beverly's name lit up the screen and my stomach dropped, but I answered it on speaker so Paul could hear. She didn't bother with hello. Her voice came through sharp and demanding, asking if I'd made my decision about surrendering my teaching license. I took a breath and told her I wasn't deciding anything because her loan didn't legally exist. The silence on her end lasted maybe 3 seconds before she started screaming. Actually screaming. Saying I'd regret defying her and she'd make sure I never worked in this state again, and I was destroying her son's future. Paul grabbed the phone from my hand and hung up without saying anything. His face was white and his hands were shaking, and I realized this was the first time he'd ever really stood up to his mother in a way that mattered. I went to the school that day trying to focus on my students, but my mind kept wandering to what Beverly might do next. Dismissal came at 3:15, and I walked my class out to the parent pickup area like always. That's when I saw Beverly's car. A black Mercedes parked across the street in the public lot, just sitting there with Beverly behind the wheel staring at the school entrance. My heart started pounding, and I felt scared in a way I hadn't felt before because she'd come to my workplace. My principal noticed me standing frozen on the sidewalk and followed my gaze to Beverly's car. He asked if I was okay, and I explained briefly that my mother-in-law was harassing me over a financial dispute. He looked at Beverly's car and then back at me and said, "Nobody threatens my teachers." He pulled out his phone and I thought he was calling the police, but instead he just walked toward Beverly's car. She saw him coming and drove away before he got close. He came back and told me to let him know if she showed up again and he'd have security handle it. That evening around 6, Paul's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Tamara with the subject line cease and desist letter attached. We opened it together on his laptop and read through the formal legal language. The letter stated that Beverly's loan claim was fraudulent, that the payments had been gifts under trust terms, that she had no legal right to repayment, that she must stop all contact regarding the fake debt immediately or face legal action. The letter was 3 pages long and referenced specific trust law statutes and case precedents. Tamara had sent it to us for approval before serving it to Beverly. Paul looked at me and asked if we were really doing this. I told him we didn't have a choice because his mother had declared war first. He printed 2 copies, one to keep and one to deliver. We drove to his parents' house with Paul holding the letter in his lap and me driving because his hands were still shaking. Paul got out of the car in his parents' driveway, and I stayed behind the wheel with the engine running. I watched him walk up to the front door and ring the bell. Khalid answered after maybe 30 seconds. Paul handed him the letter without saying anything, and Khalid started reading it right there in the doorway. I could see his face change as he read. His eyebrows went up and his mouth got tight, and he looked at Paul with something that might have been shame. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw his lips move and Paul nodded. Then Beverly appeared behind Khalid, pushing past him to see what was happening. She grabbed the letter from Khalid's hands and started reading. Her face went red and then white and then red again. Beverly looked up from the letter and laughed. Actually laughed like Paul had just told her a joke. She said something I couldn't hear from the car, but I saw her gesture with the papers. Paul said something back and his voice was quiet, but I could tell from his posture he wasn't backing down. Beverly kept talking and laughing and waving the letter around. Then Paul said something else and Beverly's laugh stopped. Her face went completely still. Paul turned and walked back to the car and got in and told me to drive. I pulled out of the driveway and asked what he'd said to make her stop laughing. He told me he'd said that trust fraud is a criminal matter, not civil, so her lawyers can't make it disappear. I reached over and squeezed his hand. We filed the formal complaint with the trust administrator the next morning at 9 when their office opened. Paul called from our apartment and put it on speaker. The administrator answered, sounding professional and slightly bored until Paul explained why he was calling. Then her voice changed. She asked Paul to repeat what he'd just said about Beverly misrepresenting gifts as loans. Paul went through the whole story again while I emailed her scanned copies of all the documents. The trust payment authorizations that said gift, Beverly's fake loan agreements, the interest calculations, everything. The administrator went quiet for a long time after Paul finished talking. When she spoke again, she sounded genuinely shocked. She said this would trigger an immediate investigation of all Beverly's trust access. She said they took misuse of trust funds very seriously. She said someone would contact us within 48 hours with next steps. Beverly started calling Paul's phone that afternoon. The first call came at 1:30, then 2:15, then 3:05. Paul didn't answer any of them. He just sat on our couch watching his phone light up over and over with his mother's name. By 5:30, she'd called 17 times. Then the voicemail notification came through. Paul played it on speaker. Beverly's voice came through the phone sounding different from I'd ever heard it. High and tight and almost hysterical. She said we were destroying the family. That we were ungrateful and cruel. That Paul's grandmother would be ashamed of him for attacking his own mother. That we'd regret this for the rest of our lives. The message went on for almost 2 minutes before cutting off. Paul deleted it without saying anything. Paul's younger sister called that evening around 7. Paul answered and put her on speaker. She asked what was going on because Beverly was having a breakdown and claiming we were stealing from the family. Paul explained the actual situation. The trust fraud. The fake loans. The attempt to force me to give up my teaching license. His sister went completely quiet on the other end. The silence stretched out so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said that's really messed up. She said she was sorry. She said she'd always known their mother was controlling, but she didn't realize it went this far. Paul thanked her, and they hung up. He looked at me, and I could see relief in his eyes because at least one person in his family believed us. The trust administrator called back 2 days later asking for an in-person meeting to discuss the investigation findings. We met at the estate lawyer's office because he'd offered to sit in as our representative. The administrator arrived carrying a thick folder and looking genuinely angry. She sat down across from us and opened the folder and started laying out papers on the conference table. She said Beverly had been misusing trust funds for years in small ways, but our case was the most blatant example they'd found. She said Beverly had been filing false documentation claiming educational gifts were loans to multiple family members. She said the trust board was recommending Beverly be removed as an authorized trustee. She said they were also considering referring the matter to law enforcement for possible criminal charges. Paul's face went pale when she said criminal charges. I squeezed his hand under the table and asked what happened next. The administrator said that was partly up to us. She said Beverly had been filing false documentation with the trust administrator, claiming these educational gifts were loans to multiple family members. We sat there staring at the papers spread across the conference table, while the administrator explained that Beverly had been running this scheme for years with smaller amounts. She said Paul's cousin received trust money for graduate school, and Beverly later tried to collect it back with interest. She said Paul's nephew got trust funds for a medical procedure, and Beverly sent him a bill 6 months later. The administrator's hands shook slightly as she flipped through the evidence, and I realized she was genuinely angry about this. She said the trust board held an emergency meeting that morning, and voted to recommend Beverly be removed as an authorized trustee effective immediately. Paul's face went completely white when she said that because his mother had controlled trust distributions for almost 15 years. The administrator pulled out another document and slid it across to us. She said the board was also considering whether to refer the matter to law enforcement for possible criminal charges related to trust fraud and document falsification. I felt Paul's hand grip mine under the table so hard it hurt. The administrator looked at us and said that decision was partly up to us, since we were the victims who brought this to light. She said if we wanted to pursue criminal charges, the trust would support us fully with documentation and testimony. She said if we preferred to handle it as a private family matter, they would respect that choice. But Beverly would still lose all trust authority. Paul couldn't seem to form words, so I asked what the timeline looked like for making that decision. The administrator said we had 2 weeks to think about it and discuss with Tamara before the board needed to finalize their recommendation to authorities. We drove home in complete silence because Paul was processing the reality that his mother had committed actual crimes against multiple family members. I kept glancing over at him while I drove, and his jaw was clenched, so tight I could see the muscle twitching. We got back to our apartment, and Paul went straight to the bedroom without saying anything. I gave him space for about an hour before I knocked on the door. He was sitting on the edge of our bed staring at his phone, which showed 17 missed calls from Beverly. I sat down next to him and waited because I knew he needed to talk, but didn't know how to start. Finally, he said his whole childhood made more sense now because his mother had always used money to control everyone, and he just thought that was normal. He said he remembered his cousin crying at Thanksgiving one year about owing Beverly money, and everyone told the cousin to just pay it back and stop complaining. He said he thought his cousin was being dramatic, but now he realized Beverly had trapped him the same way she tried to trap me. I asked Paul what he wanted to do about the criminal charges, and he looked at me like I'd asked him to cut off his own arm. He said he didn't know if he could actually send his mother to jail, even though she'd tried to destroy my career and our marriage. I understood that conflict, but I also pointed out something he needed to hear. I said Beverly was willing to force me to give up my teaching license and leave the state just to control his life. I said she spent 2 years planning a scheme to separate us, and didn't care if it ruined me completely. I said she was still calling him right now, probably to manipulate him into protecting her from consequences. Paul looked at his phone again and then turned it off completely. He said we should wait and see what Beverly does next before deciding about criminal charges. He said if she took responsibility and actually apologized, maybe they could work through this as a family. He said if she kept attacking us and refusing to admit wrongdoing, then he'd consider prosecution. I agreed that waiting made sense because Beverly's next move would tell us everything we needed to know about whether she was capable of change. The next morning, Tamara called saying Beverly's lawyer had contacted her trying to negotiate. I put her on speaker so Paul could hear, and Tamara sounded amused when she explained the offer. Beverly's lawyer said his client was willing to graciously forgive the debt in exchange for us dropping the trust complaint. Tamara actually laughed out loud at that and said she told him there was no debt to forgive since the payments were legally gifts. She said she also informed him the trust investigation was completely out of our hands now, since the board had already voted to remove Beverly's authority. She said Beverly's lawyer got quiet for a long time before asking what it would take to make this go away. Tamara told him nothing because Beverly created this situation through fraud, and now she had to face the natural consequences. She said the lawyer tried to imply we were being vindictive, and she shut that down immediately by reading him the list of family members Beverly had scammed over the years. Paul asked if the lawyer said anything about Beverly's state of mind, and Tamara said he mentioned she was very upset and felt betrayed by family. I almost laughed at that because Beverly felt betrayed when she was the one who'd been running fraud schemes for over a decade. Tamara said she'd keep us updated if the lawyer contacted her again, but she doubted Beverly would try negotiating once she realized we had no control over the trust board's decisions. 2 days later, Paul's sister called him sounding uncomfortable. She said their mother had stopped going to the country club for her regular tennis and lunch dates. She said some of Beverly's friends had been asking questions about family drama, and Beverly was humiliated that people were talking. Paul asked what kind of questions, and his sister said something about trust fund problems and legal issues with a daughter-in-law. Paul's face hardened because that meant Beverly's social circle knew at least some version of what happened. His sister said Beverly was blaming us for spreading lies and destroying her reputation. She said their mother claimed we made up the whole thing because I was jealous of her wealth and wanted to turn Paul against his family. I could hear the doubt in his sister's voice, like she wasn't sure what to believe. Paul told her very calmly that Beverly had committed fraud against multiple family members, including his cousin and nephew, and the trust board had evidence of years of false documentation. His sister went quiet and then asked if that was really true. Paul said yes, and that Beverly had tried to blackmail me into giving up my teaching license by claiming I owed her $42,000 for what were actually trust gifts. His sister made a small shocked sound and said she had no idea it was that serious. She said she'd been thinking it was just some misunderstanding about payments, but fraud and blackmail were completely different. Paul thanked her for calling and said he knew this was hard for the whole family. After he hung up, he looked exhausted and said at least his sister believed us now. 3 days after that, Khalid called and asked to meet with just Paul. I told Paul I was fine with that because his dad deserved a chance to talk without me there. They met at a coffee shop near Khalid's office, and Paul came home 2 hours later looking like someone had rearranged his understanding of his entire childhood. I asked what happened, and Paul sat down heavily on our couch. He said his dad admitted he'd been enabling Beverly's controlling behavior for 30 years. He said Khalid apologized for not stopping her from trying to destroy our marriage, and said watching her scheme against me was his wake-up call that things had gone too far. Paul's voice cracked a little when he said his dad told him Beverly had always been manipulative, but Khalid convinced himself it was just her way of caring. He said Khalid realized he'd been making excuses for Beverly while she hurt people, and he couldn't do it anymore. I asked if Khalid said anything about the criminal charges possibility, and Paul nodded. He said his dad told him to do whatever we thought was right because Beverly needed to face real consequences for once in her life. He said Khalid was tired of cleaning up her messes and protecting her from accountability. Paul looked at me and said his dad seemed lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying a weight for decades and finally put it down. I told Paul I was proud of his dad for being honest, and Paul said he wished it hadn't taken his mother trying to destroy me for his father to finally see the truth. The formal notice came from the trust 5 days later. Paul opened the certified letter and read it out loud while I made dinner. The trust had officially removed Beverly's authorization to approve any payments or distributions for other beneficiaries. She could still receive her own quarterly distributions, but she had zero control over anyone else's access to trust funds. Paul's hands shook holding the paper because this was real and final, and his mother had lost something she'd controlled for 15 years. His phone buzzed with a text and he showed it to me. Beverly had sent him 4 words. "You've ruined everything." Paul stared at that message for a long time before typing back a response. He wrote that she ruined it herself by committing fraud and trying to control his life through manipulation. He wrote that he loved her, but he wouldn't let her hurt people anymore. He wrote that when she was ready to take real responsibility and apologize sincerely, he'd be willing to talk. He sent it, and then turned his phone off again, because he knew she'd call immediately. My student loan servicer called me at the school the next day during my lunch break. The representative sounded confused and said they'd received a legal notice about a payment dispute on my account. She asked if I was trying to reverse the payments that had been made over the past 2 years. I explained the whole situation as briefly as possible about Beverly making payments without my knowledge, then claiming they were loans and trying to collect with interest. The representative went quiet and then said she needed to note the account that payments were made under duress. She said they'd flag the account to prevent any future unauthorized payments and asked if I wanted to change my account access information. I said yes, and she helped me update everything right there on the phone. She also mentioned that since the payments were gifts, not loans, I didn't owe anyone anything, and my loan balance was legitimately reduced. I thanked her and hung up, feeling relieved that at least that piece was handled properly. A package arrived at our apartment 3 days later with no return address. Paul opened it and found his grandmother's jewelry inside. There were pearl earrings and a gold bracelet and a sapphire ring that Paul said his grandmother wore every day. There was a note in Beverly's handwriting that said, "Since you hate family, so much you can have these to remember what you destroyed." Paul's face went red reading that, and he immediately put everything back in the box. He wrote a note on the back of Beverly's saying, "We love family, just not manipulation and fraud." He drove to his parents' house and left the box on the front porch without knocking. When he got back home, he told me his mother was still trying to make herself the victim and twist reality to avoid taking responsibility. He said returning the jewelry felt good because he wouldn't let her use family heirlooms as weapons in her manipulation campaign. The next morning at the school, Ophelia brought me coffee before first period started. She handed me the cup and said she could see this whole situation was wearing on me. I thanked her and admitted I was exhausted from dealing with Beverly's constant attacks and manipulations. Ophelia sat down at the desk next to mine and said her own mother-in-law had tried to control her marriage with money 20 years ago. She said her husband's mother offered to buy them a house, but only if Ophelia quit her teaching job to stay home. She said when they refused the offer, the mother-in-law made their lives miserable for 2 years. I asked how they got through it, and Ophelia smiled. She said they set firm boundaries and stuck to them no matter how much pressure they got. She said it was hard and painful, and some family relationships never recovered. She said, but setting those boundaries early saved them from decades of misery and control. She squeezed my hand and told me what Paul and I were doing was brave and necessary. She said Beverly would either learn to respect boundaries or she'd lose her relationship with her son, but either way we'd be free. I felt tears in my eyes because I really needed to hear that from someone who'd been through something similar. The trust administrator called 3 days later, and I answered on speakerphone so Paul could hear. The administrator confirmed that every payment Beverly made came from the family trust established by Paul's grandmother for direct family education expenses. Those payments were legally classified as gifts under trust law and could not be converted to loans after the fact. Beverly had no legal claim to repayment of any kind. The administrator said formal documentation would arrive by certified mail within 48 hours confirming this status. I hung up and sat on our couch staring at nothing because my brain needed time to process that the nightmare was actually ending. Paul pulled me against his chest and I felt his heartbeat through his shirt. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon and I opened it standing in our apartment hallway. The official trust letterhead declared that all $36,000 in payments were irrevocable gifts with no repayment obligation. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. Then I cried standing there holding the letter because 2 years of Beverly's manipulation and the last week of terror were finally over. Paul found me there and read the letter himself. We ordered Chinese food that night and ate it sitting on our living room floor with the letter propped against a lamp where we could see it. Paul apologized for not recognizing his mother's manipulation sooner, and I told him we figured it out together, which was what mattered. He picked at his lo mein and admitted he was thinking about his whole childhood differently now. He said he remembered dozens of times his mother used money or gifts to control situations, and he just thought that was normal. I squeezed his hand because there was nothing I could say to fix 30 years of learned behavior. Sunday dinner happened at Khalid's insistence, and Beverly showed up acting like nothing had happened. She kissed Paul's cheek and asked about his week at work in this bright, cheerful voice. Paul waited until we were all sitting at the table before he spoke. He told his mother calmly that we would have a relationship only if she respected boundaries and stopped trying to control our lives. Beverly's fork clattered against her plate. She stared at Paul and said I had turned her son against her and she would never forgive me for it. Paul stood up and his chair scraped loud against the floor. He told his mother she did this herself by trying to blackmail his wife. We left before Beverly could respond, and I heard Khalid calling after us, but we kept walking to our car. Khalid called the next morning while I was getting ready for work. Paul answered, and I watched his face change as he listened. His father was moving into the guest house and separating from Beverly temporarily because he could not watch her destroy relationships anymore. Paul sat down on our bed looking shocked. He told me his dad sounded more at peace than Paul had heard in years. The school year continued, and I threw myself into teaching because my classroom felt like the one place where things made sense. My students were reading Charlotte's Web, and their enthusiasm about Wilbur and Charlotte's friendship was exactly what I needed. My principal stopped by during my planning period to observe how I organized my lesson materials. He mentioned that he admired how I handled a difficult personal situation without letting it affect my work. I thanked him and felt proud because my job was the one thing Beverly could never touch. Paul came home from his first therapy session looking exhausted. He dropped his keys in the bowl by our door and collapsed on the couch. He said it felt good to finally talk about his mother's manipulation patterns with someone objective. The therapist had helped him see how Beverly used money and guilt to control him since childhood. Paul's sister called a week later with news from the country club. Beverly's friends apparently knew the full story now because people were asking pointed questions about why Beverly tried to destroy her daughter-in-law's career. Paul's sister said their mother was facing real social consequences for the first time. Beverly was furious but had no one to blame but herself. A letter arrived from Beverly's lawyer on expensive letterhead. The letter stated that Beverly was dropping all claims against us and requested we not pursue criminal charges. I called Tamara immediately, and she said this was as close to an admission of wrongdoing as we would get. We agreed to move forward without prosecution because dragging Beverly through criminal court would hurt Paul more than her. The trust administrator sent final documentation 2 weeks later. The letter confirmed the case was closed and Beverly had no authority over other beneficiaries' distributions. All previous payments to my loans were confirmed as irrevocable gifts that could never be challenged. I bought a frame at the store and hung this letter in our apartment hallway where I would see it every day. Paul started meeting Khalid for lunch every Thursday at a diner halfway between their offices. The first few times felt awkward because they'd never really talked without Beverly controlling the conversation. Khalid ordered the same turkey club every week and slowly started admitting things he'd never said before. He told Paul that he knew Beverly manipulated people, but he'd convinced himself it was just her being protective. He said watching her try to destroy my career made him realize he'd been making excuses for 30 years. Paul came home from these lunches looking lighter somehow, like he was getting to know his father for the first time. Khalid laughed more now and made jokes about his terrible golf game instead of just nodding along to whatever Beverly said. Paul told me his dad seemed genuinely happy in the guest house, cooking his own meals and watching whatever shows he wanted. A thick envelope arrived at our apartment with Beverly's lawyer's return address. Inside was a formal letter on expensive paper that clearly had Tamara's legal language all over it. Beverly acknowledged that all payments to my student loans were gifts from the trust, and she had no legal right to claim repayment or interest. The letter said she regretted any misunderstanding about the nature of the payments. Paul read it 3 times looking for any hint of real apology, but the whole thing felt hollow and forced. He folded it carefully and put it in our filing cabinet anyway, saying at least her lawyer made her put it in writing. I could tell he wanted his mother to actually be sorry, not just legally covering herself, but this was probably the closest we'd ever get. Paul's sister called in early November asking if we'd come to her house for Thanksgiving instead of dealing with Beverly at the country club. She said she was hosting a small dinner and wanted it to be drama-free for once. We said yes immediately because the idea of sitting through Beverly's cold politeness sounded exhausting. Khalid accepted too when Paul's sister invited him, which meant Beverly would be spending Thanksgiving alone. Paul's sister mentioned that their mother refused to come if I was there and wouldn't apologize for what she'd done. Beverly apparently told people she was choosing to have a quiet holiday by herself, but everyone knew the truth. Paul felt sad about his mother being alone, but he wasn't willing to sacrifice our peace to fix her choices. I checked my student loan balance online one night while Paul was watching a game. The number had dropped to $18,000 thanks to all those payments Beverly made. The original amount had been $54,000 when we got married, which meant I'd actually pay these off in a few years instead of decades. Paul came over to look at the screen and we both started laughing at the complete mess of it all. Beverly's manipulation scheme to control our lives had accidentally given us real financial help we desperately needed. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that her worst impulses ended up benefiting the person she was trying to hurt. I could actually see a future without this debt hanging over me, and that felt better than any apology Beverly could write. Paul's boss called him into the office on a random Tuesday in December. I was grading papers when Paul texted that he got promoted to senior analyst with a significant raise. He came home that evening grinning and we opened a cheap bottle of wine to celebrate. The promotion meant we could finally start saving real money for a house down payment, something that felt impossible 6 months ago. We sat at our kitchen table with a calculator figuring out how much we could save each month. We were still careful with money and definitely not living fancy, but the constant anxiety about my loans had lifted. Paul said it felt good to plan for our future instead of just surviving paycheck to paycheck. Beverly started sending Paul text messages in January about neutral family stuff. She'd mentioned that his aunt was visiting or that the country club was renovating the dining room. Paul responded with short, polite answers but kept firm boundaries about not discussing anything personal. She never asked about me or our life together, and Paul never volunteered information. The texts came every week or two, and Paul treated them like weather reports from someone he used to know. He told me he was okay with having a distant relationship with his mother if that's what she could handle. I watched him respond to these messages with the same energy you'd give a casual acquaintance, and I was proud of how he protected what we'd built. I ran into Beverly at the grocery store in February while buying vegetables for dinner. She was coming out of the organic section with her cart and looked directly at me for half a second before her eyes slid past like I was invisible. She kept walking toward the checkout without any acknowledgement that she'd seen me. I stood there holding a bag of carrots, feeling absolutely nothing about her pretending I didn't exist. Paul had made peace with having a mother who couldn't be part of our real life, and I didn't need her approval or acknowledgement anymore. I finished my shopping and drove home thinking about how much power I'd given her opinion of me before, and how little it mattered now. Khalid filed official separation papers in March after Beverly refused to go to marriage counseling. He told Paul over lunch that he'd spent 30 years walking on eggshells and adjusting his whole life around Beverly's moods. He said he was done trying to fix something that Beverly didn't think was broken. Paul supported his dad's decision even though watching his parents' marriage end made him sad. Khalid moved his stuff out of the guest house into a small condo near us, and he seemed genuinely excited about picking his own furniture. Paul helped him hang pictures and set up his TV, and they ordered pizza like it was any normal Saturday. His dad kept saying how quiet and peaceful his place was, and Paul knew that was exactly what Khalid needed. The spring semester started in late January, and I stood in front of a new classroom full of students who had no idea what happened last year. They didn't know about Beverly or the loans or any of the drama that consumed my life. There was something really refreshing about that clean slate and just focusing on teaching reading and math. My students were excited about our science unit on butterflies and kept asking a million questions about caterpillars. I realized this was what actually mattered in my life, not Beverly's approval or her country club friends' opinions. These kids needed me to show up every day and teach them, and that was enough. Paul and I started looking at houses online in March, scrolling through listings after dinner. We found a small 3-bedroom house that needed work, but had good bones and a big backyard. The kitchen was outdated and the bathroom needed tiles, but the price was in our range. We drove by it on a Saturday and both felt something click into place. Paul called the realtor and we put in an offer that same week. When the seller were accepted our offer, Paul grabbed my hand and we just sat in the car outside the house that would be ours. It felt like proof that we'd built our life on our own terms, without Beverly's money or control, and that made it mean everything. Beverly found out about the house before Paul even told her because his sister mentioned it during one of their awkward phone calls. The text came through while we were eating dinner on our folding table in the empty living room. Paul looked at his phone and his face went flat in that way it did whenever his mother reached out. He showed me the screen where Beverly had written that she could have bought us something much nicer if we'd just asked. I watched Paul set his phone down without responding and go back to eating his pizza. We both knew she was trying the same thing again, using money as a way to make us feel small or dependent. Paul didn't take the bait, and I was proud of him for that. The closing happened on a Tuesday in March, and we signed what felt like a million papers at the title company office. The realtor handed us the keys and we drove straight to the house even though it was getting dark. We walked through every room turning on lights and Paul kept touching the walls like he couldn't believe they were actually ours. That weekend we bought paint and rollers and spent Saturday covering the ugly beige walls in the living room with a soft gray color I'd picked out. Khalid showed up Sunday morning with his toolbox and helped us install new light fixtures in the kitchen and hallway. He worked quietly and efficiently and seemed genuinely happy to be doing something useful for us. There was something different about having family support that didn't come with conditions attached or secret plans to control us later. Khalid stayed for lunch and we ordered sandwiches and ate them sitting on the floor because we didn't have furniture yet. He told us about his new condo and showed us pictures of the balcony where he was planning to set up a grill. Paul seemed more relaxed around his dad than I'd seen him in months. My principal scheduled a formal classroom observation in April as part of the annual review process. She sat in the back with her clipboard while I taught a lesson about fractions using pizza slices as visual aids. The kids were engaged and asking questions, and I felt like I was actually reaching them in a way that mattered. 2 days later, the principal called me into her office, and I had that moment of panic before she smiled and told me I'd received an excellent review. She specifically mentioned my student engagement and the creative way I'd designed the lesson plans. Driving home that afternoon, I thought about how Beverly's threat to take away my teaching license had actually lit something inside me. I'd spent the whole year proving to myself that I was good at this job, that I belonged in that classroom, that no amount of money or manipulation could take away what I'd worked for. The review felt like proof that I'd won something bigger than just the legal battle. Paul's sister called in May, sounding nervous and excited at the same time. She told Paul that she'd gotten engaged to her boyfriend of 3 years and wanted us to be in the wedding party. Paul congratulated her and asked about the venue and the date and all the normal questions. Then his sister went quiet for a second before saying she wasn't having Beverly involved in any of the planning. She said she'd learned from watching what Beverly did to us, and she wasn't giving their mother any opportunity to turn her wedding into a control game. We told her we were honored to be part of it, and after Paul hung up, we just sat there feeling happy for her and sad about the whole situation at the same time. It wasn't fair that she had to exclude her own mother from wedding planning, because Beverly couldn't be trusted to act like a normal person. The trust sent out annual statements in June showing everyone's distributions and account activity. Paul opened his and went still while he read through the numbers. Beverly's distributions had been reduced significantly because of the investigation findings from last year. The trust administrator had apparently implemented new oversight rules, and Beverly's access to discretionary funds was now limited. Paul showed me the statement, and I could see he felt conflicted about it. This wasn't something we'd asked for or pushed for, but it felt like natural consequences catching up to his mother. Paul said he didn't celebrate seeing his mother face financial restrictions, but he acknowledged that she'd created her own problems by misusing the trust. We hosted our first real dinner party at the house in early July. Ophelia and her husband came with a bottle of wine, and Khalid brought dessert, and Paul's sister showed up with her fiancé, who we were meeting for the first time. The house was still mostly empty, but we'd bought a dining table and chairs and set everything up in the kitchen. It was loud and chaotic, with everyone talking over each other and laughing, and the kind of gathering that felt warm and real. This was the family we were building. The people who showed up without expecting anything in return or keeping score of favors. Paul looked around the table at one point and caught my eye, and I knew he was thinking the same thing. Beverly sent a birthday card to Paul in August with a check for $500 tucked inside. Paul looked at it for a long time before sitting down and writing a note on the back of one of our housewarming cards. He wrote that he'd rather have a genuine relationship with her than her money, and he hoped someday they could figure that out. He mailed the card back with the check still inside and told me he didn't expect her to respond, but at least he'd tried to open that door. Beverly never replied, and Paul said that was her choice to make. Summer stretched into those long evenings where it stayed light until 9, and we started working on the backyard. We bought vegetable seeds and tomato plants and spent weekends digging up the weedy grass to make garden beds. Paul joked that we were literally putting down roots, and I realized he was right. We'd built this life completely on our own without Beverly's money or approval or control. She couldn't touch what we'd created here because it belonged only to us. I planted basil and peppers and watched them grow while Paul built a small fence around the garden to keep out rabbits. Every evening we'd go out there and water everything and check for new growth, and it felt like the most normal, peaceful thing in the world. My student loan balance hit $15,000 in September, and I could actually see the finish line now. Every payment I made felt like reclaiming a piece of my financial independence and proving I never needed Beverly's help that came with invisible strings attached. The loans would be paid off in less than 3 years at this rate, and that felt possible in a way it never had before. I'd survived Beverly's attempt to trap me with fake debt and come out stronger on the other side. Paul's therapy sessions were helping him recognize patterns he'd never noticed before. He came home one evening and told me his therapist had pointed out how Beverly used money and guilt to manipulate not just him, but his whole family. Paul was learning to set healthy boundaries with everyone, not just his mother, and he said he wished he'd started this work years ago. Better late than never, though, and I could see the difference in how he handled family drama now compared to a year ago. A cream envelope arrived in the mail 2 weeks later with Paul's sister's return address embossed in the corner. I opened it at the kitchen table while Paul made coffee, and inside was a wedding invitation on thick paper with gold lettering. The ceremony was scheduled for October at a vineyard an hour away, and I was reading through the details when a handwritten note fell out onto the table. Paul's sister had written that Beverly was invited because their mother would cause problems if excluded, but she'd be seated in the back row far from us, and security would be present if needed. I showed Paul the note, and he read it twice before setting it down. We looked at each other across the table, and I knew we were thinking the same thing about whether we wanted to deal with Beverly at a family event. Paul said his sister shouldn't have to exclude her own mother because Beverly couldn't behave like an adult, and I agreed because we weren't going to let Beverly's manipulation control our relationships with other family members anymore. I filled out the RSVP card right there, marking 2 guests for the ceremony and reception, and Paul walked it out to the mailbox before we could second-guess the decision. Khalid called Paul the next morning while we were getting ready for work and asked if we could meet for lunch because he had news to share. We met him at a restaurant near his office, and he looked different somehow, lighter in the shoulders and less tense around his eyes. He told us the separation from Beverly was becoming permanent, and he'd signed a lease on a condo 3 blocks from our house starting next month. Paul sat back in his chair processing this information, while Khalid explained he was rediscovering who he was outside of Beverly's shadow after 30 years of walking on eggshells. He said he'd forgotten what it felt like to make decisions without calculating how Beverly would react or what demands she'd make in response. Paul reached across the table and squeezed his dad's hand without saying anything, and Khalid smiled in a way I'd never seen before. Over the next few weeks, Paul and his dad started having dinner together every Tuesday, and their relationship changed into something healthier and more honest than it had ever been. Paul came home from those dinners talking about real conversations they were having about life and mistakes and growth, and he said it felt like an unexpected gift that came from this whole mess with Beverly. The school year wound down in that chaotic way it always does, with field day and award ceremonies and students asking if I'd be their teacher again next year. My principal called me into his office during the last week, and I worried for a second that something was wrong until he asked if I'd be willing to mentor a new teacher starting in the fall. He said he was asking me specifically because I handled pressure well and maintained professionalism even when dealing with difficult personal situations. I accepted immediately because teaching was my calling, and Beverly's scheme to take away my license had only made me more committed to this career. The principal shook my hand and said the new teacher was lucky to have me as a mentor, and I left his office feeling proud of what I'd built, despite Beverly's attempts to destroy it. Paul and I sat on our back porch one evening in late June, watching the sunset paint orange and pink across the sky above our garden. The tomato plants had grown tall and were starting to flower, and the basil was thick enough that we'd been cutting it for cooking. Paul was quiet for a while, just holding my hand and watching the light change, and then he said we actually did it and built our own life. I squeezed his hand because he was right, and we'd stood up to manipulation and protected what mattered and came out stronger on the other side. The garden stretched out in front of us with everything we'd planted growing exactly how it was supposed to, and I realized this was what winning looked like. Not revenge or dramatic confrontations, but just sitting here together in a space we'd created that Beverly couldn't touch or control or take away from us.